Las Vegas, August 1972. 3:14 a.m. The air in the Caesars Palace corridor smelled of expensive gin and stale cigar smoke. This was not a sanctioned bout under the neon lights of the arena. There were no cameras, no judges, and no screaming fans. The rules were absolute: 4 steel walls, a gold-trimmed ceiling, and exactly 60 seconds of transit. It was a single ride from the penthouse to the lobby that was never meant to be recorded in the history books. If word had leaked out that night, a multi-million-dollar boxing career would have ended before the sun rose over the Nevada desert. I've spent 30 years as an investigative biographer, documenting the underground history of combat sports. I don't care for the polished stories found in PR kits or the choreographed sequences in movies. My sources are the men who were actually in the room, the cornermen, the security detail, and the silent witnesses who saw the legends when the masks came off. I approach every story with a skeptic's eye and a historian's precision. What I'm about to tell you is a story that promoters spent 4 decades trying to bury. It's a story about the day the physics of the ring met the reality of the street, in a space no larger than a closet. Everything began 3 days earlier with a casual insult in a crowded hotel bar. At the time, Bruce Lee was in Las Vegas for a series of private meetings regarding his upcoming projects. He was a man on the verge of global superstardom, but in the eyes of the boxing establishment, he was still just an actor, a movie martial artist. Staying at the same hotel was Jack Iron Miller. Miller was a heavyweight contender, a mountain of a man with a 90% knockout rate and a deep-seated disdain for anything that wasn't a traditional Western punch. To Miller, Bruce was a dancer, a theatrical performer who wouldn't last 30 seconds in a real exchange with a professional. Miller represented the Western establishment's core belief that 230 pounds of disciplined muscle and a heavy jab could overcome any man alive, regardless of their technique. In the high-stakes world of 1970s heavyweights, size wasn't just an advantage, it was the law. And Jack Miller was a man who lived by that law. He spent his nights in the hotel bars, surrounded by a circle of hangers-on, loudly mocking the little guy who claimed to have revolutionized fighting. Bruce, for his part, ignored the bait. He was a man of stillness, focused on his own path. But in a city like Vegas, ego eventually demands a confrontation. The night of the incident, the heat outside was suffocating, but inside the Caesars Palace penthouse, the atmosphere was even tighter. Miller had been drinking, not enough to be sloppy, but enough to feel invincible. He saw Bruce heading toward the elevators and signaled to his promoter, a man named Frankie, and a young bellhop who happened to be nearby. Miller didn't want a fight in the lobby where the police would intervene. He wanted a private session. He wanted to see the look in the actor's eyes when he realized that movie magic doesn't work when you're trapped. The doors of the elevator slid shut, sealing the 4 of them inside. It was a tribunal of sorts. You had the titan, the actor, the promoter, and the witness. Frankie, the promoter, knew exactly what was happening. He had millions riding on Miller's next title shot. He should have stopped it, but a part of him was curious. He wanted to see if the hype around Bruce Lee was real, or if he was just another product of the Hollywood machine. The bellhop, a kid barely 20 years old, stood in the corner with a tray of ice, his heart hammering against his ribs. He expected the big man to win. Everyone did. The elevator began its descent. The silence was heavy, broken only by the faint hum of the cables. Miller didn't waste time. He used his massive frame to crowd Bruce into the corner, physically occupying the space that Bruce needed to breathe. This is a classic heavyweight tactic, using mass to intimidate, to make the opponent feel small and insignificant before a single blow is struck. Miller was testing Bruce's nerves. He began a series of feints, snapping his heavy hands inches from Bruce's face. The air from the punches whistled past Bruce's ears, but Bruce didn't move. He didn't flinch. He just watched. In that tiny, gold-trimmed box, there was no room for the flashy kicks or the cinematic movement that Bruce was known for. There was no footwork to rely on. The confinement changed the nature of the conflict. It was no longer about who could move better. It was about who could react faster in a space where there was nowhere to run. Miller, emboldened by Bruce's lack of reaction, leaned in closer. His breath smelled of expensive bourbon. "You look smaller in person, dancer," he whispered. The promoter, Frankie, felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He saw the way Bruce was standing. It wasn't a defensive posture. It was something else. Bruce wasn't cowering. He was calibrating. He was occupying the center of his own gravity, waiting for the shortest distance between 2 points to reveal itself. Miller, sensing the lobby approaching, decided to end the game. He wanted to leave Bruce on the floor of the elevator as a final insult, before the doors opened. Miller threw a lightning-fast jab, a punch that had ended the nights of a dozen professional boxers. It was a blur of leather and muscle, meant to snap Bruce's head back and establish dominance once and for all. It was the kind of punch that shouldn't be missable at that range, but then the physics of the room shifted. What few people know about Bruce Lee is that he didn't fight in the traditional sense, he intercepted. As Miller's fist flew forward, Bruce's hand was already there. There was no struggle, no frantic blocking. It was a ghost catch. Bruce caught Miller's wrist mid-air with a precision that seemed impossible. The impact was jarring, the sound of skin hitting skin echoing off the metal walls like a gunshot. Miller's arm stopped dead, as if he had punched a brick wall that hadn't been there a millisecond before. For several seconds, nobody breathed. The bellhop's tray rattled, the ice cubes clicking against the glass. Miller stared at his own hand, then at the man holding it. His heavy breathing stopped instantly. The silence in the elevator became deafening. In that moment, the reality of the situation set in for everyone in that car. Miller's speed, the pride of the heavyweight division, was nothing compared to Bruce's timing. The little dancer had neutralized 230 pounds of momentum with a single calculated movement. The look on Miller's face shifted from arrogance to a raw, primal confusion. He was a man who had spent his life being the hammer. For the first time, he felt like the nail. He tried to pull his arm back, but Bruce's grip was like a steel vice. It wasn't just strength, it was the way Bruce used his entire body to anchor the connection. Frankie, the promoter, stepped forward, his hands raised in a desperate attempt to de-escalate. He realized that if this continued, his prize fighter was going to get hurt, or worse, he was going to be humiliated in front of a witness. "That's enough, Jack," Frankie muttered, his voice shaking. But Miller was past the point of listening. The embarrassment of having his punch caught was a stain he couldn't live with. He felt the elevator floor shudder as they passed the middle levels. He had seconds left. He pulled his other arm back, loading up for a short, heavy hook, the kind of punch designed to break ribs and end careers. This wasn't a feint anymore. This was a professional heavyweight trying to do real damage. And that was when the story took a turn that the boxing world would spend the next 40 years trying to forget. The elevator was passing the 7th floor. The digital display above the door flickered with a rhythmic, mechanical click. Inside that small gold-trimmed box, the air had been sucked out of the room. Jack Iron Miller, his face flushed with a mixture of alcohol and wounded pride, had reached the point of no return. He wasn't just sparring anymore. He had loaded up his entire 230-pound frame into a short, devastating hook. In a space this tight, there was no way to miss. There was no room for Bruce to slip the punch, no room to dance, and no room to retreat. The promoter, Frankie, froze. He knew that sound, the sound of a professional heavyweight committing everything to a single blow. It's a sound that usually precedes a hospital visit. But as Miller's shoulder dipped and his fist began its lethal arc toward Bruce's jaw, the physics of the elevator seemed to warp. Bruce Lee didn't try to escape the strike. In the science of Jeet Kune Do, retreating is often a wasted motion, especially when your back is already against the wall. Instead, Bruce did the one thing Miller never expected. He moved into the danger. He occupied the very space Miller was trying to claim. But then, everything changed. The detail that the witnesses would struggle to describe for years wasn't the speed, but the economy of it. Bruce's lead hand, which had been resting near his waist, didn't wind up. There was no telegraph, no movement in the hips that a boxer would recognize. It was a straight surgical line. While Miller was still in the middle of his big swing, Bruce's fist traveled exactly 1 inch. The impact wasn't a thud. It was a crack, like a whip snapping in a vacuum. Bruce's fist buried itself into Miller's solar plexus with a density that defied his 145-pound frame. It wasn't just a punch. It was a total transfer of kinetic energy. Then happened the part that was never supposed to leak. The force of the strike was so concentrated that the entire elevator car, a multi-ton piece of machinery suspended by heavy steel cables, actually shuddered. The bellhop felt the vibration in his teeth. It was as if the car had hit a snag in the shaft, a momentary lapse in gravity. Miller, a man who had taken head-on collisions from the hardest hitters in the heavyweight division, didn't just stumble. He folded. It was a moment of pure, terrifying clarity. Miller's lungs seized. The air was driven out of him so violently that he couldn't even groan. His massive arms, once so threatening, went limp. His knees hit the plush red carpet with a heavy, muffled thud. He wasn't unconscious, but he was physically deleted. His nervous system had been short-circuited by a man 60 pounds lighter who hadn't even moved his feet. The silence that followed was absolute. For some seconds, nobody breathed. The elevator bell chimed, a cheerful, high-pitched ding that felt absurdly out of place. The doors slid open to the lobby. The air from the air-conditioned hallway rushed in, smelling of fresh lilies and the distant sound of slot machines. Bruce Lee didn't say a word. He didn't look down at the man gasping for air at his feet. He didn't check his knuckles or adjust his shirt. He simply stepped over Miller's legs and walked out into the lobby. His gait was the same as it had been when he entered, calm, deliberate, and entirely centered. Frankie, the promoter, stood frozen in the elevator. He looked at the bellhop, then down at his starfighter. Miller was on his hands and knees, his face a ghostly shade of grey, trying desperately to remember how to inhale. Frankie's mind was racing, but not about Miller's health. He was thinking about the betting odds. He was thinking about the upcoming title shot. He was thinking about the millions of dollars that would vanish if the public ever found out that a movie star had dismantled a heavyweight contender in the time it took to travel 5 floors. "You didn't see anything," Frankie whispered to the bellhop. His voice was no longer that of a confident promoter. It was the voice of a man trying to save a crumbling empire. "You tell anyone about this, and you'll never work in this town again. You understand?" The kid nodded, his eyes wide, still staring at the spot where Bruce had been standing. He didn't care about his job. He had just seen a man stop a train with a single inch of movement. He had seen the myth of size always wins collapse in real time. For years, this story remained a ghost. Frankie did his job well. He buried the incident under a mountain of non-disclosure agreements and professional favors. He kept Miller away from the press for a week, claiming a training injury had delayed his schedule. Miller himself never spoke of it. How could he? In the hyper-masculine world of 1970s boxing, admitting that a smaller man had dropped you with a 1-inch strike was a death sentence for your reputation. But the truth has a way of leaking through the cracks of history. The bellhop eventually grew up. He moved away from Vegas, and in the quiet corners of bars and gyms, he started telling the story of the night the elevator shook. Most people didn't believe him. They called it an urban legend, a tall tale fueled by the growing cult of Bruce Lee. They pointed to the lack of police reports or hospital records, but the detail that always remained consistent, the detail that makes me believe this wasn't just a story, was the elevator quake. It's a detail too specific for a layman to invent. It speaks to the unique mechanics of Bruce's power, the ability to ground his entire mass into a single point of impact. What few people realize is that Bruce Lee didn't do it to prove a point to Miller. He didn't do it for the audience or the ego. For Bruce, that 60-second ride was a private validation of a lifetime of work. It was proof that his philosophy, that the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, wasn't just a line from a script. It was a law of nature. The incident was immediately hushed up, not to protect Bruce, but to protect the marketability of the boxing world. If the public realized that precision and timing could negate raw mass so effortlessly, the entire structure of combat sports would have been questioned. They needed the big man to remain the ultimate authority. As the years passed, Miller's career faded. He became another name in the long list of heavyweights who almost made it. But those who knew him closely said he was different after that summer in Vegas. He stopped talking about dancers and actors. He developed a quiet, almost fearful respect for the martial arts, a shift that no one could explain until the elevator story started to circulate decades later. The air in that elevator went cold for a reason. It was the moment the world of old-school brawling met the future of combat science. It proved that power isn't measured by the size of the muscle, but by the efficiency of the delivery. In a world that obsessed over the big man, Bruce Lee proved that an inch of precision is worth more than a mile of momentum. Las Vegas, August 1972. It was a moment that was never supposed to be recorded. A battle won in the silence of a closing door. The promoters might have spent 40 years trying to bury it, but the physics of that night remain undeniable. The world can doubt. The skeptics can call it a myth, but the man who walked out of that elevator knew the truth, and the man who remained on the floor, he never forgot it. Some stories don't need a camera to be real. They just need a witness who was brave enough to remember what happened when the lights were off and the doors were shut. In the end, it wasn't a fight, it was a demonstration, and the lesson was simple. Never mistake stillness for weakness, because sometimes the most dangerous thing in the room is the man who doesn't need to move at all.